The sun was dipping low behind the jagged mesas, painting the desert sky in deep swirls of red and gold. Dust hung in the air, thick and dry, curling around the worn boots of a lone figure pacing along the edge of the trading post. Her hands trembled, clutching the reins of a restless chestnut horse whose flared nostrils snorted small clouds into the cooling air. The horizon seemed endless, yet her heart felt trapped between the past she couldn't forget and the uncertain stretch of land before her. She had come a long way from the crumbling homestead on the northern prairie, the one where her father's voice had always carried more weight than the wind. Every step of the journey had been measured in silence. In moments when the harsh sun baked her skin and the wind threatened to sweep away all she had carried inside, now, standing before the horse that someone else had put a price on, she felt the strangest mix of desperation and defiance. "Don't buy the horse. Buy me," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of tears she refused to hide. The words carried across the dusty yard, scattering the last hints of sunlight, and seemed to hang there longer than they had any right to. A shadow shifted near the edge of the corral, quiet and deliberate. The Apache had been there from the moment she arrived, his presence a calm, dark contrast to the chaos of her emotions. He stood taller than most men she had ever known, lean and steady, with eyes that could pierce through the layers of fear and pride that she had wrapped around herself. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply watching. The leather of his moccasins, whispering over the cracked earth with every careful step. Her chest heaved, the dust in her throat burning with each hurried breath. "I'm not asking for the horse," she whispered, almost too low for anyone else to hear. "I'm asking for. Don't mistake my words, but there's nothing left I can give the world except myself." Her hands fell to her sides, palms raw from gripping the reins, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her solitude more sharply than the weight of the saddle beneath her fingers. The Apache moved closer, the quiet rhythm of his steps blending with the evening wind. He didn't smile, but there was a softness in his gaze, like a hidden river running through a dry canyon. "I choose you," he finally said, his voice a low whisper that somehow carried more promise than the clamor of the trading post or the distant calls of the cattle. The words were simple, yet they struck her with a force that left her breathless. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let the hope that lingered behind his words rise above the despair she had carried for so long. Yet fear twisted inside her like a rattlesnake coiled beneath the rocks. The world beyond this place had taught her to expect betrayal, to trust only what could be measured in hard work, sweat, and the occasional luck of survival. And yet here in the fading light of the desert, a man whose loyalty she could barely begin to understand had chosen her. The horse shifted nervously, stepping forward and kicking at the dust. Its restless energy mirrored the turmoil in her chest. She realized how tightly she had been holding on to control over the journey, over the land, over her own heart. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice softer now, almost a plea. "How can you choose something you don't understand?" The Apache's eyes did not waver. "I know more than you think," he replied. His voice held a stillness that seemed unshakable, quiet certainty that contradicted everything she had been taught about the unpredictable ways of men. There was something ancient in the way he moved, something that spoke of survival and stories older than the trails she had ridden. She wanted to ask him how he could be so sure, but the words lodged in her throat. The truth was, she didn't know if she could trust him more, even trust herself to hope. Behind them, the trading post creaked and groaned in the evening wind. A skeleton of civilization clinging to the edge of the wilderness. The wooden sign swung unevenly, catching the last rays of sun, and the scent of smoke and horses filled the air. Merchants and travelers murmured in low tones, oblivious to the quiet storm building in the dusty corral. And yet, in that space, time seemed to slow. The horizon stretching wide and empty, full of possibilities she had never dared to consider. Her hand brushed the horse's flank, feeling the muscle tense and pulse beneath the skin. She thought of all the journeys that had brought her here, all the roads she had traveled alone, and all the nights spent listening to the wind carry away her fears. Now the path ahead was uncertain, not carved by the predictable routines of work or survival, but by a choice made in a whispered moment between two people whose lives had been shaped by hardships few could understand. The Apache stepped closer, his shadow merging with hers in the dying light. "You don't have to choose the horse," he said again, softer this time, almost like a secret meant only for her ears. "You just have to choose yourself." His words hung in the air, as fragile and fleeting as the last bird flying home across the mesas. She wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to run and hide and throw herself into the familiar comfort of solitude. But something deeper, quieter, called to her. She lifted her eyes to his, searching for any sign of hesitation, any crack in the calm that seemed to surround him. There was none. Only the certainty that he had offered, the promise of a hand extended in a world that had long since forgotten kindness. And though fear still curled in her stomach like a winter snake, she felt the first sparks of courage, small but persistent, igniting in her chest, a distant rumble. Soft and low, rolled across the desert, echoing the beat of her heart. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the night was already stretching its fingers across the land, bringing with it shadows she could not yet name. The horse whinnied softly, sensing her hesitation, and she tightened her grip on the reins, unsure whether she was holding on to hope or simply the last shred of control she could claim. The Apache waited, patient and unwavering, as the sun finally slipped behind the mesas and the first stars blinked awake in the violet sky. "Don't wait too long," he murmured, almost as if he feared the moment would vanish before it truly began. "There are choices we can't undo once the wind carries them away." Her chest rose and fell with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She didn't know what lay ahead, or if the road they might travel together would be anything like the life she had imagined. All she knew was that, for the first time in a long while, someone had seen her not just the surface, not just the name or the deeds, but the parts of her she had buried so deeply even she had almost forgotten. And in that recognition, that simple choice whispered in the cooling desert air, she felt a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, her story was about to change as the shadows deepened and the wind whispered secrets through the canyons. The question hung between them, unspoken yet undeniable: would she step forward, risking everything for a promise made in the fading light, or retreat into the safety of her old solitude, leaving the desert to swallow her once again? The horse pawed at the ground, restless, as if urging her to decide. And the Apache's hand hovered near hers, ready to bridge the distance, but only if she dared to reach for it. The night closed in, and with it, the weight of choices yet to be made, of journeys not yet begun, and of hearts not yet surrendered. The air trembled with expectation, and the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer that would set the course of everything that followed. The first stars shimmered overhead, cold and distant, and she realized that the hardest part of the journey was not the miles she had ridden or the obstacles she had faced. It was the leap of trust, the surrender to a possibility she had never allowed herself to believe. The Apache's gaze met hers, steady, unyielding, and full of quiet conviction. The world outside the corral might be harsh, unpredictable, and cruel, but in that moment, in that suspended hush of twilight and dust, something new, fragile, and dangerous was beginning, and she knew that whatever choice she made, nothing would ever be the same. The night wrapped the trading post in a blanket of silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of hooves and the distant cry of a coyote echoing across the mesas. She had stayed by the corral longer than she should have, letting the moment stretch, as if stretching it could make the fear easier to bear. But the desert air was cold and sharp, and every gust of wind carried memories she had hoped to leave behind. Memories of burned fields, of broken fences, of nights when the wind seemed to whisper threats through the thin walls of her old cabin. She finally turned toward the Apache. Noticing the way his shadow stretched long over the cracked earth, he moved with a quiet grace, unhurried, as though he belonged to the land itself. There was something in the way he carried himself, steadiness, that drew people in. Even when the air around him seemed ready to tear itself apart, she wanted to ask him how he could be so calm, so certain, when the world they both lived in had taught her to expect danger at every turn. "Why do you trust me?" she asked at last, her voice barely more than a whisper. The words seemed too heavy for the dry air, too fragile to survive the night. He paused, watching her with eyes that reflected the pale light of the rising stars. "Because some things are clearer than fear," he said, simple and unshakable, leaving her with more questions than answers. Her mind wandered back to the life she had known before this desert, before the trading post, before the choice she now faced. Her family had been proud, stubborn in the way only people of the prairie could be. They had worked hard, tilled the soil, raised horses and cattle, and carried a stubborn belief that no one else could survive the land as they had. But the land had its own will, and it had claimed everything they had worked for. Fires had taken barns and fences, floods had washed away crops, and sickness had swept through the homestead when she had been too young to fight back. By the time she left, she had known loss in a way that left her wary of all promises. She had ridden for weeks to reach the trading post, following trails etched into the desert that few dared travel alone. Every night she had listened to the wind whip against the rocks, imagining it carried voices from the past, warning her, testing her. And every morning she had mounted her horse and pressed forward, driven by the stubborn hope that something better awaited, something that could heal the quiet ache inside her chest. The Apache's presence had unsettled her at first. She had seen him from a distance, moving like a shadow along the edges of the post, always near enough to watch, never close enough to intrude. His reputation had preceded him. Traders and townsfolk whispered stories of his skill, of the way he had outwitted raiders, guided travelers, and survived where others could not. Some said he had a gift for reading the land, for understanding the signs that the wind and sky offered. She didn't know whether to trust the stories. Yet there was no denying the quiet authority he carried with him, a calm rooted in experience rather than arrogance. For days, she had observed him, noting the careful way he treated the animals, the quiet respect he gave the elders, and the patience he showed to those who sought his counsel. He was not a man easily impressed, nor was he quick to anger, and yet something in the way he looked at her that evening, when the sun bled across the horizon, had unsettled her entirely. He had chosen her, he had said, and in those words there was both a promise and a question. She could not yet answer. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of movement near the post. A wagon rumbled over the uneven ground, and voices called out in sharp, hurried tones. She tensed, hand resting on the pommel of the saddle, feeling the horse respond to her attention with shifting hooves. The Apache's head turned slightly, eyes narrowing toward the source of the noise. "Trouble," he murmured, almost to himself. And she realized for the first time that whatever this place promised, it also held dangers she had not yet imagined. She had learned early that life in the West demanded both courage and caution. Bandits, rival ranchers, and unscrupulous traders were only the surface of the challenges she had faced. Beneath that lay the unpredictable wilderness, the unforgiving heat, sudden storms, and the quiet cruelty of isolation. Each obstacle had tested her, carving patience and cunning into her character. Yet she had never faced someone like him. The Apache seemed untouched by fear, unburdened by the weight of doubt that so often plagued her every step. A memory surfaced, sharp and bitter. Her father had once told her, "Never rely on someone else to carry your life for you. The land takes what it wants, and mercy is rare." She had repeated those words in her mind countless times during her journey, holding them like a shield against the uncertainty of strangers. Yet, standing beside the Apache, she felt that shield trembling. He was not offering mercy, exactly, nor was he offering protection in the conventional sense. He was offering choice, and that was something far more dangerous than anything she had faced on the open plains. The trading posts. Lanterns flickered, casting uncertain light across the wooden beams and dust-laden ground. Merchants closed shutters and secured wagons, whispering warnings to one another, as if the wind itself carried a premonition. She glanced at the Apache, wondering how he could remain so composed while the rest of the world seemed on edge. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on a distant ridge where the first hints of movement began to stir. A small group of riders appeared, horses kicking up dirt, their shadows long and threatening in the glow of the lanterns. "Visitors," the Apache said quietly, his voice like a warning carried on the wind. "Not all of them friendly," He moved toward her side, close enough that she felt the warmth radiating from him. A stark contrast to the chill settling over the desert night. She noticed the way his hand hovered near his belt, ready yet unhurried, the quiet assurance of someone who had faced countless threats and lived to see them pass. Her heart raced. She wanted to turn away, to flee into the darkness, and let the sand swallow her footprints. Yet some unspoken pull held her in place. The horse pawed the ground again, sensing her uncertainty, and she realized she had become aware of more than just the approaching riders. There was something in the Apache's stance, something silent and deliberate that told her he was ready for more than a simple encounter. Whatever was coming, it would not be easy. Her mind raced back to stories she had heard in small towns, of men and women caught in the crossfire of rival clans, of lives reshaped in a single night by choices made too quickly or trust given too freely. She had seen enough to know that danger often came dressed in familiar clothing, that appearances could be deceiving. And yet she could not pull her eyes from the Apache, the figure of calm certainty against the gathering chaos. The riders drew closer, the sound of hooves and voices sharper now, a rhythm that matched the pounding of her own pulse. She swallowed hard, gripping the reins tightly, and for the first time considered the possibility that her journey had been leading her not just to a choice, but to a confrontation she had no way of predicting. She wanted answers, a map of what lay ahead, yet she knew the desert offered none. Every step forward was a gamble, every decision a test of courage she could not rehearse. The Apache finally spoke. Low and measured, whatever they seek, we will meet it together. His words were simple, but in them lay a weight she could feel deep in her chest. There was trust, yes, but also a warning. The world beyond the corral was not kind, and the choices they made in the next moments could shape everything that followed. She nodded, not entirely certain she believed in the strength of their combined courage, but unwilling to let fear dictate her next move. The horse shifted under her, restless, its ears flicking toward the oncoming riders. Somewhere behind her, the post creaked and groaned, a reminder of fragile civilization against the raw, untamed wilderness. As the first rider crested the ridge, silhouetted against the fading stars, she caught a glimpse of eyes that were hard and wary, faces masked with suspicion and intent. The group slowed, as if measuring their approach, and she felt the desert air tighten around her like a held breath. The Apache's hand rested lightly on hers, a subtle anchor in a night that promised uncertainty and peril. Her thoughts drifted back, briefly, to all she had left behind: the burned homestead, the long trail across the prairie, the lonely nights by the fire. And yet, in the quiet tension of this desert evening, she felt the first true pull of possibility, chance that the journey was not yet over, that her story was still being written, line by line. In the dust beneath her feet and the steady presence of the man who had chosen her, the riders slowed again, forming a hesitant line across the ridge. She could hear the faint scrape of leather, the muted murmur of voices, and the distinct sense that something was about to unfold that would demand all her courage and wits. Her fingers tightened on the reins, her heart thudding in rhythm with the restless hooves, and she realized that whatever awaited them, it would test not only their strength, but the fragile bond of trust forming between them. The Apache shifted slightly, alert yet calm, eyes scanning the approaching group with a practiced intensity. He had chosen her, and in doing so, he had drawn her into a world that was no longer simply about survival. Now it was about decisions, about courage, and about the willingness to face the unknown with someone who refused to falter. And in that moment, she understood the truth of the desert, of the open sky, and of the journey she had undertaken. Nothing was certain. Danger could arrive at any turn, and yet sometimes the hardest choice was simply to step forward, to trust, and to let the wind carry them both into the unknown. The riders halted at the base of the ridge, shadows mingling with the darkening landscape. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and electric, and knew that the next moments would define much more than this night. She met the Apache's gaze, steady and unwavering, and felt the faintest spark of courage ignite in her chest. The desert was alive with possibility, peril, and promise on she was standing at its heart. Ready, uncertain, and utterly human. The wind shifted, carrying whispers across the mesa, and with it, the sense that the first move had been made. The riders had stopped. But the tension between them and the trading post stretched as taut as a drawn bowstring. Shadows of men and horses merged in the lantern light, their intentions hidden but heavy in the desert air. She gripped the reins tighter, feeling the horse tremble beneath her, its body attuned to the unease that rippled outward like heat from the cracked earth. The Apache did not flinch. He remained a steady presence at her side, his hand lightly resting near hers, silent reassurance. Her mind raced, tracing the lines of their journey, wondering what had drawn these strangers to the post. It could be simple curiosity, or greed, or something far darker. Traders, bandits, or a rival rancher seeking revenge, did not know which. And the uncertainty gnawed at her with relentless persistence. She had learned that in the West, appearances were deceiving, and the quietest man could be the deadliest. Yet in the calm that surrounded the Apache, she found herself daring to hope that perhaps not all danger was immediate. Not all shadows meant harm. The leader of the approaching group, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, dismounted with deliberate caution. Dust clung to his boots, and the gleam of his rifle caught the lantern light as if it were meant to warn. He scanned the trading post, his eyes finally settling on them. A slow smile spread across his face, one that did not reach his eyes. She recognized the calculation behind it, the careful weighing of power, advantage, and threat. "You folks looking for trouble? Or just running from it?" he called out, his voice carrying over the dry wind. His tone was casual, but she could feel the sharp edge underneath. She did not answer, and the silence spoke louder than words. The Apache shifted slightly, standing taller, the lines of his body taut with readiness. She realized that, whatever this encounter would be, it would demand every ounce of patience and courage. She had learned on the long trail across the desert. Her thoughts drifted for a moment to the journey that had brought her here. She had left behind a life of quiet hardship, a homestead that demanded strength but offered little in the way of warmth. Her family had relied on her endurance, on her stubborn resolve. Yet the desert had taught her that survival often required more than strength, it demanded cunning, intuition, and the courage to make impossible choices. And now, standing at the edge of an unknown threat, she understood that the lessons of the prairie were only a beginning. The Apache's gaze never wavered. He observed the leader's movements, the subtle signals from the others in the group. The way they shifted in the dirt, their eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. There was a rhythm to his watchfulness, a deep understanding that she could not yet match. He had lived in these lands long enough to read the air, the horses, tension between men who had histories unspoken yet understood, and she realized, with a mix of fear and admiration, that she was learning from him even without words. One of the riders, younger than the others, fidgeted nervously, his hands brushing the rifle strapped across his back. He glanced toward the leader and back at them, the uncertainty in his movements betraying the careful front he tried to maintain. She saw it and wondered how many of them had been pushed into roles they did not wish for, into conflicts they had not chosen. The West had a way of shaping people as much as it broke them, she thought, and for every hardened face, there was a story buried beneath the dust and sweat. The Apache spoke softly. Almost to her alone, they seek more than the trading post. Watch closely, and you will understand. She tried to read his meaning, but the cryptic tone only added to the tension. What could they want? Goods? Revenge? Or had the desert brought them here for reasons she could not yet fathom? Her heart pounded not just from fear, but from the growing awareness that the events unfolding were part of something far larger than a single night or a single choice. Behind the post, lanterns flickered as merchants hurried to secure goods and livestock. Conversations were muted, eyes wary. She noticed a young boy, barely older than 10, holding the reins of a tired mule, his face pale and serious. He glanced at her and she offered a small nod, though her own confidence wavered. She could not yet reassure him, nor herself. The night had become a web of intentions, each thread carrying potential danger, and she felt both the weight of responsibility and the pull of fear. The leader took a slow step forward, rifle resting loosely in one hand, the other hand brushing the brim of his hat as if to shield his eyes from more than just the fading light. "We hear there's something valuable here," he said, voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. "Not just goods, but people. Information. Choices that could shift power in this valley." She stiffened, the words sinking like stones in her stomach. Power. Information. She had learned long ago that those two forces could destroy more than fire or flood. They could unravel a life quietly, leaving nothing behind but regret and ashes. The Apache's eyes flicked toward her, and she felt the same quiet message she had felt earlier. Trust. But it was not blind trust. It was the kind that demanded courage, that required her to face danger without certainty of outcome. He stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and the approaching group, a silent shield in the desert night. The leader studied him, the muscles of his jaw tightening, as if considering a challenge. He had not expected. She realized then that the tension between them was not just physical. Not just the standoff of guns and horses, it was a clash of histories, of knowledge and instinct, of choices made long before this moment. The Apache had faced men like this before, men who measured strength and intent in different ways, yet he did not underestimate them. She, too, had a history of survival, of facing the desert, the isolation, and the unrelenting demands of life. And now, those two threads, their pasts, instincts were being woven together against an unknown force approaching under the starlit sky. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the horse at her side. It had been with her through long miles, through hunger, fatigue, and fear. It was more than an animal, it was a companion, a reflection of her endurance, a reminder that strength could come in many forms. And yet she could feel its tension, its unease, as if it too sensed the undercurrents of danger approaching. She stroked its mane, whispering soft words, trying to anchor herself as the leader's voice rose again. "We've come a long way," he said, deliberately slow, each word measured. "And we're willing to wait for answers. But we don't wait forever. Some choices can't be postponed. Some chances are lost if you hesitate." His gaze lingered on her, as if weighing the value of her courage against the risk he faced. She felt the words like a challenge, not just to her, but to the Apache, and to the quiet history they both carried into this desert night. The younger riders shifted, whispering among themselves, eyes darting toward the ridge where darkness pooled and wind carried faint, eerie echoes. She could sense their doubt, their uncertainty, and it made her own fear sharper. Yet beneath the fear, there was a pulse of something else, anticipation. The thrill of facing a choice that could change everything. The Apache's hand brushed hers again, subtle and grounding, and she understood that while the danger was real, the trust he offered could be her anchor through the coming storm. From the trading post, the muffled sound of closing shutters signaled that others were preparing, watching, waiting. She realized that the post itself had become a microcosm of tension, each person a thread in a larger web, each action capable of shifting the balance in ways none could fully predict. She wondered what stories these men carried, what pasts had driven them to this ridge, to this confrontation in the starlit desert. She could see the fear and resolve mingling in their eyes, and she knew that beneath the surface, each person bore the marks of survival and loss. Just as she and the Apache did, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and distant sagebrush. A sudden movement at the edge of the ridge caught her eye, a glint of steel, or perhaps a reflection of the lanterns. The riders tensed, the horse snorted, and the Apache's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his belt. The night had become a stage for a conflict she could not yet define, confrontation layered with hidden motives, past grudges, and the ever-present risk of violence. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the desert, the stars, and the unseen forces converging in this one moment. Her choices, the Apache's readiness, and the intentions of the approaching riders were all threads tangled together, each pulling in unpredictable directions. She realized that the night would not yield answers easily, and that every second of hesitation could alter the outcome in ways she could not foresee. And in that suspended moment, as the wind whispered secrets across the mesas and shadows deepened around the post, she understood with both dread and clarity that the true test of courage was not simply surviving the night, but confronting the layers of fear, loyalty, and uncertainty that bound them all together. The first move had been made, but the outcome remained hidden, and every heartbeat carried the suspense of what might come next. The Apache's gaze met hers once more, steady, unflinching, and full of quiet determination. She nodded subtly, bracing herself, aware that the night had only just begun, and that the challenges to come would demand everything she had learned and everything she had yet to discover. The desert held its breath, the stars flickered like watchful eyes, and the first whispers of conflict began to stir among the approaching riders. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was here, in the dust, the shadows, and the quiet strength of the man who had chosen her. And she knew that whatever unfolded in the next hours would test not only courage and trust, but the fragile bonds that could shape the rest of their lives. The night had deepened into a velvet black, the kind that seemed to swallow sound and twist the shapes of the desert into shadows that moved like restless spirits. She could feel the tension coiling in her chest, a tightness that matched the horse's restless movements beneath her. Every rustle of sagebrush, every whisper of wind through the mesas seemed amplified, carrying hidden threats she could not name. The Apache stood beside her, calm as ever, yet even his stillness seemed charged. Like the desert itself had shifted in expectation of what was to come. The riders on the ridge had not advanced, but their presence was a weight she could not ignore. The leader's eyes flicked back and forth, scanning the post, calculating, measuring. The younger men shifted uneasily, their hands brushing weapons, their murmured words caught by the desert wind before they could reach her ears. She could feel the collective breath of the post, held in silent suspense. Each person sensing that the night was poised on a knife edge, her fingers tightened around the reins, knuckles whitening. The horse whinnied softly, and she felt the pulse of its fear mirrored in her own heartbeat. She glanced at the Apache, seeking reassurance, and found only that quiet certainty he carried like armor. It was both comforting and unnerving because it made her realize how much she depended on him in a moment where dependence was a dangerous thing. "They're waiting," said softly, almost a warning. "They measure courage and hesitation the same way. One wrong move, and this night could turn into something neither of us wants." His gaze swept the ridge, noting subtle shifts in the rider's stance, their barely perceptible signals. She realized he was reading far more than the eyes could tell. He was reading the intent, the unspoken calculations of men who had learned to survive on instinct as much as skill. Her thoughts drifted to the long journey that had brought her here. Every mile of prairie, every desert ridge, every lonely night by a fire had taught her to be alert, to watch, to survive. And yet, nothing in all those experiences had prepared her for the tension of a standoff, where the stakes were measured not just in life and death, but in trust, loyalty, and the fragile edge of human connection. She had faced storms and floods and the bite of hunger. But the uncertainty of human intention was a storm far more consuming. The leader moved, finally, breaking the silence that had stretched across the ridge. "Step forward, little lady," he called, his voice carrying a false ease that did not fool her. "Don't let fear decide for you. Sometimes you have to show the cards you're holding." She felt a shiver run down her spine, realizing that in the desert, words were weapons just as sharp as rifles or knives. The Apache's hand brushed hers again, grounding her. And she understood that whatever came next, she could not face it alone. Behind her, the post creaked and groaned with the night wind, a reminder of how fragile civilization seemed against the raw openness of the desert. She could see merchants peeking from windows, the glint of lanterns reflecting off their worried eyes. Even the children, usually tucked safely away, seemed alert to the rising tension. It was a delicate ecosystem of fear and courage, and she had never felt more aware of the power of a single choice. The younger riders shifted again, their uncertainty growing. She noticed small Tell's fingers brushing trigger guards, eyes darting toward the Apache's belt, restless horses stamping the ground. Each subtle movement amplified the tension, layering it with a sense of imminent danger. She realized that the balance of this confrontation could tilt in an instant. Like a knife's edge, and the smallest misstep could ignite chaos. Her mind raced, recalling lessons learned on the prairie. Watch the wind, read the ground, anticipate movements, measure the intentions of those around you. She saw patterns in the rider's hesitation, glimpses of doubt and fear that suggested they were not as confident as the leader projected. The Apache seemed to see them too, his calm assessment cutting through the panic building in her chest. She understood then that he was preparing for more than a simple confrontation. He was calculating every angle, every possibility, every risk. The leader took a step closer to the edge of the ridge, hand resting lightly on his rifle. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he called again. "But we don't wait forever. Decisions have consequences." His words carried across the desert, sharp and deliberate. She felt their weight, a tangible pressure pressing down on her, as if the air itself demanded a choice. The Apache's gaze did not waver, and she felt the first stirrings of courage. Tempered by the realization that courage alone might not be enough, suddenly, one of the younger riders bolted forward slightly, misjudging the distance to the edge. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the horses snort loud against the stillness. The movement enough to draw her heart into her throat. The Apache's hand moved, swift and precise, a warning that had no words but carried immediate authority. The rider froze, realizing he had been seen, and tension deepened as the possibility of confrontation became tangible. Her mind turned again to the horse, to its instincts, its sensitivity to the rising tension. She stroked its neck, whispering soft words she barely trusted herself to believe, trying to anchor both of them in a moment that threatened to spiral out of control. The desert seemed to press inward, the ridge and the post and the gathering riders compressing time and space till every heartbeat echoed. Like a drum signaling the approach of an unseen storm, she wondered about the stories these men carried. Every shadowed face, every hardened stare, told of survival, betrayal, and loss. She could feel their histories pressing into the present, shaping intentions she could not yet read. And she realized that understanding them fully might be impossible. What mattered now was presence, awareness, and the courage to act in the moment. The Apache spoke softly again, voice low and deliberate. "Stay close. Watch the signals. Nothing is as simple as it appears." His words carried the weight of experience, of survival in the wild, of encounters where one misstep had meant the end. She clung to them, absorbing the rhythm of his assessment. The subtle warnings embedded in his calm demeanor. The leader's eyes shifted, catching the faint gleam of a lantern in the trading post window. He frowned, exchanging a brief look with one of his men. Their whispers carried faintly across the dry air, fragments of strategy, the smallest signs of uncertainty. She noticed the shift immediately, the subtle faltering in their confidence, and felt a pulse of hope, fragile, uncertain, yet undeniable. And then, the wind picked up, swirling dust and grit into the air, obscuring the riders and the ridge. Visibility dropped, and the desert became a blur of shadow and movement. The horse snorted and shifted nervously, and she realized that the night itself had turned against them, hiding threats and amplifying danger. Every sound was magnified, the creak of leather, the scrape of boots across rock, the distant howl of a coyote. She felt herself holding her breath, waiting for something to happen, knowing instinctively that the moment of decision was drawing near. The leader spoke again, voice now edged with frustration. "Step forward. Don't waste time hiding behind hesitation." She felt the words as an attack, deliberate and sharp, and realized the pressure to act was building to a point where any choice could ignite chaos. The Apache's hand brushed hers, grounding her again, but even his calm presence could not erase the urgency threading through the night. Her thoughts flickered to the journey that had brought her here. The long hours in the saddle, the miles of isolation, the nights she had spent listening to the wind and stars, all of it had been preparation, whether she knew it or not, for this exact moment of tension. When survival would demand more than instinct, it would demand trust, courage, and the willingness to confront the unknown. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement among the post's lanterns. Shadows shifted, shapes moved, and she realized that the quiet community she had observed was no longer passive. People were positioning themselves, holding tools, preparing to intervene if necessary. The energy of the trading post combined with the tension of the ridge, creating a fragile, electrified balance. One wrong action could tip it into violence. The younger riders fidgeted again, whispering, glancing at each other, eyes wide with uncertainty. She could feel the shifting tide of fear and anticipation. The unspoken question of who would act first, who would falter, and who would take the risk that might decide everything. The Apache's gaze remained steady, locked on the leader, reading the subtle signs of indecision and strategy. She understood then that the confrontation was not just about strength or skill, it was about perception, timing, and reading the hidden currents that ran through every human interaction. Her heartbeat accelerated as the wind swirled more fiercely, carrying whispers of movement across the mesas. The ridge seemed closer, the shadowed riders more immediate, and the air itself seemed charged with expectation. She could feel it in the horse's shifting weight, in the Apache's steady presence, and in the faint tremor running through the trading post. The desert night had become a crucible, testing courage, patience, and instinct. The leader made a sudden move, stepping forward, his rifle resting lightly but deliberately in hand. The tension snapped tighter, every person at the post and on the ridge poised for action. She could see the calculation in the younger rider's eyes, subtle shift in the Apache's stance, the faint tightening of the horse's muscles beneath her. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with the possibility of violence or revelation. She realized then that the climax of the night, the confrontation, the choices, the risks, was almost upon them. Every instinct, every lesson learned on the prairie and desert would be tested in the next moments. And yet, beneath the fear, beneath the tension, there was a fragile thread of anticipation, a sense that the night might reveal not only danger, but the truth of trust, courage, and the bonds that could form between people when the world demanded everything of them. The wind carried the sound of distant hooves, the faint scrape of leather, the tensioned murmur of whispered words. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the stars overhead cold and distant. And she understood fully that the moment of reckoning was about to arrive. She met the Apache's gaze, steady, unwavering, and felt a surge of determination. The night had come alive with uncertainty, with threat, with the promise of a confrontation that would demand every ounce of courage she possessed. And then, from the shadowed ridge, the first clear movement signaled the beginning of what could not be avoided. The moment stretched taut, each second heavy with anticipation, and then the leader of the riders finally made his move. His horse lunged forward, hooves kicking up dust that swirled around the corral, and she felt the world tilt under the weight of action, finally breaking through suspense. The Apache was already in motion, stepping to the side, guiding her horse back with a calm authority that betrayed no fear, only calculation. His eyes never left the leader, reading every subtle movement, every twitch, every glance, and she realized then that all the lessons of survival he had carried with him had led to this moment. The younger riders faltered, hesitant, their uncertainty plain. She saw the fear and doubt in their eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to hope that the confrontation might be settled not with violence, but with clarity and courage. The Apache's voice cut through the dust-filled air, low and commanding. "Enough," he said, and it carried the weight of someone who had lived through countless dangers and emerged unbroken. The words reached not just the leader, but the entire ridge, and she felt the tension ease slightly. Though danger still lingered in the night air, the leader's horse stopped short, almost reluctantly. The man's hand hovered over his rifle, then dropped slowly. The younger riders followed suit, their initial boldness dissolving into cautious respect. She realized that the standoff had been as much about understanding, about reading the intent of another, as it had been about threat. Courage, yes, but also restraint, wisdom, and the willingness to step back when needed. The Apache's presence had shifted the balance, and she marveled at the quiet authority he carried, the kind that made people hesitate before making a wrong move. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool desert air fill her lungs, and let herself finally notice the stars above. The black velvet of the night seemed less threatening now, and the harsh edges of fear began to soften. She looked at the Apache, the man who had chosen her, who had stood beside her without faltering, and she felt the full weight of gratitude and something deeper trust, fragile and earned, resting between them. He had given her more than protection. He had given her the courage to face the unknown and still move forward. The leader on the ridge tipped his hat, small gesture of concession. "You've got spirit," he said, his voice edged with begrudging respect. "Not many would hold their ground the way you two just did." She felt the tension unwind further, though she knew caution would always be necessary in these lands. The riders slowly withdrew, dust rising in clouds behind them as they turned back toward the ridge. Leaving the trading post and its fragile peace intact, the Apache exhaled, a small movement that went unnoticed by anyone but her. It was the first sign that he, too, had felt the weight of the night and the danger that had stalked them in the dark. She reached out instinctively, brushing her fingers lightly against his arm. A silent acknowledgement that she had seen him not just as a protector, but as someone who had stood with her through fear, uncertainty, and choice. He allowed the touch, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The first hint of ease she had seen all evening, she turned her attention back to the trading post. To the merchants who had hidden behind doors and windows, now peeking out cautiously, their relief was palpable. She felt a strange warmth in her chest at the sense of community that had held together under pressure. Even the young boy with the mule offered a small, wide-eyed smile. She nodded at him, and he returned it with a bravery that seemed remarkable for his age. The night had tested them all, yet here they were, unbroken, each carrying their own stories of courage and survival. The Apache led her away from the corral, walking slowly toward the edge of the post where the wind swept across the desert. She felt the cool air brush her face, carrying the faint scent of sage and earth. For the first time since arriving at the post, she felt the tension finally ease, enough to think clearly about the future. There would be challenges, certainly, and dangers that could not be predicted, but for the first time, she felt that she was not facing them alone. "You were brave," the Apache said quietly, his voice carrying a softness that contrasted with the intensity of the standoff. "Not just tonight, but in getting here, in standing your ground and making choices when the world seemed to offer none." She felt a flush rise in her cheeks, a mixture of pride and lingering fear. She had never thought of herself as brave, only as stubborn enough to keep going. But hearing it from him made it real in a way she could hold on to. She looked down at the horse, chestnut and restless earlier, now calm, its ears flicking toward the ridge as if sensing the retreat of danger. It was a reminder that even in the harshest moments, there was room for connection, for loyalty, for understanding between beings who shared the journey. She reached down, stroking the animal's mane, feeling the pulse beneath her fingers, and realized how much the horse had been a partner through all of this, a living anchor in a world that had demanded constant vigilance. As they walked together, the post behind them settling into quiet once more, she felt the layers of the night begin to peel away. She thought of the choices that had brought her here. The journey across prairie and desert, the nights spent listening to wind and stars. And she understood that courage was not about never being afraid. It was about acting even when fear threatened to overwhelm, about trust, about holding on when everything else might fail. The Apache's hand brushed hers once more. A subtle reassurance, a promise that whatever lay ahead would not be faced alone. She allowed herself a small smile, a mixture of relief and anticipation, knowing that the night had changed everything. The trading post would endure, the people within it would continue their lives, and she herself had discovered a depth of strength she had never acknowledged before. She thought of the younger riders on the ridge, their hesitation, their retreat, and she realized that fear and courage often coexisted. Choices had consequences, yes, but restraint, clarity, and understanding could shape outcomes in ways brute force could not. The desert had tested them, but it had also taught them, revealing truths about trust, human connection, and the quiet power of measured courage. The wind carried a soft whistle across the mesas, a sound that felt like the echo of lessons learned and dangers survived. She lifted her face to the stars, the constellations clear and cold above, and felt a sense of quiet possibility. The night had demanded much, yet it had offered more understanding, connection, and the realization that choices, even when fraught with risk, could lead to new beginnings. The Apache led her to the edge of the post, where the light of lanterns mingled with the silver glow of the moon. He stopped, turning to face her fully, and she felt the gravity of the moment. "The world out there," he said quietly, "is harsh, and it doesn't forgive easily. But you've proven yourself tonight. Not to me or to anyone else, but to yourself." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. The journey had been hers, and she had survived, grown stronger, and discovered that courage was not a gift, but a choice made again and again. She looked back at the post, at the people whose lives had intersected with hers for just this one night, and she felt the warmth of shared survival. They had faced fear together, navigated uncertainty, and emerged with a quiet triumph that did not need celebration to be real. The horse shifted beside her, and she knew that their journey was far from over, yet the hardest night had passed. The path ahead would demand more courage, more trust, and more choices, but now she felt ready. Strengthened by experience and the knowledge that she was not alone, the Apache's eyes met hers again, steady and full of unspoken understanding. He reached out, and she took his hand, a silent acknowledgement that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The desert stretched wide and open beyond them, a world of danger, opportunity, and mystery. Yet for the first time, she felt that the horizon was not only a threat, but a promise. As the wind carried the faint scent of sage and dust across the trading post, she allowed herself a long, deep breath. The night had been a crucible, testing courage, trust, and endurance, and she had emerged shaped by it, tempered like steel against the heat of uncertainty. The lessons of the prairie, the desert, and the human heart had converged in one night, leaving her with clarity, resolve, and hope. She glanced at the Apache once more, the man who had chosen her, and felt the full weight of their shared experience. The night had demanded bravery, calm, and decisiveness, and they had met it. The trading post behind them would endure. The riders had retreated, and the desert was calm once more. Though its quiet was only temporary, a reminder that life here demanded constant vigilance. She patted the horse's neck, whispering thanks, and felt the rhythm of its pulse steady beneath her. Every creature, every person, every shadowed corner of the desert had played a role in the night's events. She understood now that survival was more than skill, it was connection, intuition, and the courage to trust. To step forward when everything seemed uncertain, the Apache squeezed her hand lightly. And she knew that the choice she had cried out across the corral days ago had been affirmed not through words alone, but through action, courage, and the unspoken bond that now linked them. The desert night stretched ahead, full of possibility, danger, and promise. But she felt ready to meet it. Together, they turned toward the horizon, the first hints of dawn brushing the mesas with pale gold. The wind carried the lessons of the night, the echoes of fear and courage, and the knowledge that choices made with heart and mind could shape not only the moment, but the path that stretched far beyond. She lifted her face to the sky, the vastness of the desert opening before her, and felt a quiet, enduring truth settle in her heart. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Trust was a choice, and the bonds forged in moments of trial were stronger than any danger the world could throw their way. And with that, she stepped forward, hand in hand with the Apache, into the first light of a new day, knowing that the journey had only just begun, but that she had survived, learned, and chosen herself in a way that would carry her through whatever lay ahead.